Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, and I'm just going to provide a general outlook on the market. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the Telegram channel, which you can find a link to in the description below. Now, I know a lot of people are not super happy right now. Clearly, the prices have been going down a decent amount here over the last several weeks. But I just wanted to try to zoom out here, try to provide a perspective on the market. Whether it ends up being the right perspective, time will tell. But I just wanted to talk about Ethereum, and obviously you guys can leave your feedback down in the comments below. So one of the things we've talked about for quite a while for Ethereum, and we've talked about it for so long that I'm sure many of you are actually tired of talking about it. And it's basically the same thing I've been saying for the last year, is that to me, for the most part, it seems like Ethereum is just simply in this long reaccumulation phase between $2,000 and $4,000. Now, I understand at right now that that's mostly going to fall on deaf ears, and additionally, I understand that it might also not work out, right? Like it might not be the case that it's just a reaccumulation range between $2,000 and $4,000. But I did want to continue to talk about why I think it could be, and to say that, based on the analysis we've done for the last year in terms of thinking that Ethereum can go sideways for up to a year after an explosive move to the upside, that line of thinking isn't dead at this point. So generally speaking, one of the things we've looked at to sort of understand the move that we're currently in is just going back to a prior move that Ethereum saw when we then went sideways for a while. Okay, and basically we're going back to this first move right here, where then Ethereum just went sideways for about a year. And one of the things we can do is we can overlay this move and then just sort of shift it over to what we currently experience. Now, if you go over to, say, the March capitulation and then just sort of overlay it, this is what you get. This is what you get. But remember, it does take longer to realize higher prices as the market cap grows, and you can see that this cycle, Ethereum has grown not nearly as quick as it did back over here. So we had this impulsive move to the upside, and then Ethereum went sideways for about a year. And one of the things that I think is difficult is understanding what sideways means. Sideways back in 2016, as we've mentioned before, was more or less spending most of that time between approximately, let's call it $7 or so. We actually had a wick down to $6. So if we just include the entire range, we basically went from around $6 up to approximately $14 or so. And then we had one wick. Sorry about that. We actually had one wick that took us a little bit higher. But we spent most of the time in this range right here. Okay, something between, say, $7, up to around $14, $15. So while we look at this and visually we just say, oh yeah, like it was a sideways move here for Ethereum that again lasted from the time we entered this range. It lasted for over a year, 371 days before Ethereum broke out of that range. And we've talked about this, this sideways move by Ethereum in the past many times. And I really wanted to talk about it again. And we actually even spoke about this idea in a recent video on Ethereum, is that going back down to the bottom of the range is a possibility that exists within the framework of going sideways between these two values. Again, back in 2016, it was more or less $7 to $14, something like that. So far, for the last year, Ethereum has spent a majority of its time between $2,000 and $4,000, with brief periods above and below that level. Okay, and so remember, this phase over here lasted 371 days. So I'm going to move this over here for a minute. If we go look at where Ethereum is today and sort of like talk about the range that we've been in, we've spent most of the time between 2 and 4K, with very brief periods where we went below it. Okay, so most of the time has been spent between approximately $2,000 to $4,000. And in a similar manner as say 2016, we did briefly, pop out of the range over here, which we also did something very similar earlier on in this range right here. So we popped out of it very briefly. And one of the things that I wanted to really hone in on during this long sideways move by Ethereum that we saw back in 2016 was that we sort of tested the upper boundary up here a number of times, right? You can even see we tested it 3 separate times. And off the first test, we got rejected close to the bottom of the range. And you might even say that we went to the bottom of the range if we just go up to the candles here and leave the wick for the day traders. If you look at sort of just some of these candles, we came back down to the bottom of the range off of the first test. So you see the same thing here, right? We went up to the top and then came back down to the bottom of this range on the first test. And then we came back up to the top, back down. We did have a wick, technically speaking, I guess, that went all the way down, but we spent a majority of our time sort of in this sort of middle region up here, which is somewhat similar to what we saw here after getting rejected off of that point. And then we had one more test of the all-time high, the third test. Now, the main difference, I guess, is that the all-time high for Ethereum was actually put in on that wick, not this one on when looking at, say, comparing it to today. But one of the things we can do to further illustrate this idea is to take this bar pattern and overlay it. And after that third attempt, where Ethereum got rejected off of the top of the range, you can see it then capitulated back down, and it fell. I mean, from the all-time high, it fell approximately 70%, 71%. From the top of the range, it fell about 60%. So you could argue that it fell approximately, let's just say 60 to 70%, depending on where you are measuring it from. And I mean, with that said, it did not stop Ethereum from going back down to that bottom of the range one more time, where it had spent a number of times revisiting, okay? And then on this final test, it then actually made a sustained move higher, all right? And I wanted to overlay this move with what we've currently seen so far over the last year. And this is what it looks like, okay? And so we're going to zoom in here and try to see if there's anything that can be better understood from what's going on. And before we get too far into this, I just want to say, this is just dubious speculation. As we always say, I don't know what's going to happen in the short term. The main thing I do know is I believe Bitcoin will trend up with time. And I also do think Ethereum will trend up with time. That's my main, investment thesis for this asset class, is I think they generally will trend higher with time. And then we do our best to try to understand what those moves might look like. And arguably a year ago, when we came into this range and we said, look, it actually would make sense for us to go sideways for approximately 1 year before really moving out of it. I wanted to revisit that idea, and we've been talking about it for the last year. So from when we entered the range in April of 2021, you could argue we entered it a little bit sooner if you want to take the bottom of this range as to where these wicks are right here, okay? Because the wicks on these moves by Ethereum actually took us down to approximately 1,700, okay? So you could argue the range is actually between, say, technically speaking, 1,700 all the way up to 4,800. But if we say we got into this sideways range back in April, then we've actually been in it for approximately 287 days. You compare that to what we saw over here from when we got into this range, and before we actually broke out to the upside, it was 371 days. Again, it's a big if, right? It's a big if. But if Ethereum were to repeat this same pattern to go out another 100 days or so, it would mean we're still stuck here until Q2, right? Until maybe even late in Q2. Obviously, at the current time, this is actually probably the most optimistic scenario, right? Is that we come back up in Q2 and then break out in Q2. I would actually prefer to be a bit more conservative and say, maybe Q2, but let's plan to be here a bit longer. But I wanted to just overlay this final move that we saw back in 2016 and what it sort of looked like, because after it tested it once, twice, and 3 times, it then had this very similar bleed that we're seeing now, right? A very similar very similar type of move where it was just a very slow bleed by Ethereum over many weeks, okay, and many months, in fact. These are weekly candles. And so the bleed, overlaying it, if you were to sort of just shift it to today, the bleed would have started when it started here, and then if we measure it, it would have gone until the starting the last week of January, but really it went into early February because the beginning date of this week is January 31st. So then the bleed would have actually continued on into early February. And it would have corresponded with a fairly nice liquidation event. And to give you an idea of what that would mean if it were to repeat this cycle, and again, I would actually consider this an optimistic scenario, right? Like an optimistic scenario would be staying in this range and not having to come back down over here, because no one wants to go back over there, right? So what would that mean? Well, for Ethereum, that would mean it could still see more downside as far as basically where it went before, where it went earlier in the year, right? Back in July, back in February, going back down to the same level that we've tested multiple times. And that's going to be a big test, because if we hold it, if Ethereum holds that level, then, and we start trending back up, you could imagine that the sentiment for the market could come back relatively quickly once people take a step back and realize, wait a second, it's not necessarily this doom and gloom like everyone's making it out to be. It's just that Ethereum had a very impulsive move that took it up significantly in a very short period of time, and then the market is now adjusting to the new normal, and it's taking it a year to do so. So I don't want to just say spread hopium for the sake of spreading it. I understand that if Bitcoin continues to just pull back for many more months, then Ethereum's going to go down with it. I completely understand that. But I just wanted to continue to show the same thing we've showed for the entire year. I'm not going to abandon it right when we're getting to the end of the end of it, right? I'm not going to abandon it now. I will abandon it if we break out in a different fashion, right? Like if we break out this way, or if we break out and come back down this way, obviously then we can't say that this is useful anymore. But I did want to mention it because we have spoken about it a lot. The idea that after you get some major move by Ethereum, it tends to go sideways for a while before seeing another breakout. And this isn't the only time that Ethereum has done this, right? I mean, there was another time that Ethereum did this as well, and it was back in say the middle of 2017, where it sort of went sideways for a while. Really, you could say it was, maybe it was putting in higher lows, right? Maybe you can say it was putting in higher lows, but the upper bound was limited in June, and then again in August, and then finally it broke through in December. So this range here lasted for approximately, well, if we take it from when we really first entered it right here, you could say this one lasted about 203 days, which is a fairly significant amount of time for it to be sort of stuck in that area. Because again, we think about Ethereum as having just gone straight up in 2016, 2017, and early 2018, but in fact it was filled with periods where it was stuck in a range here, and then it was stuck in a range here, and then it ultimately did break out. But I don't know how many people were around in crypto back then, but I remember this phase, and it was also looking pretty bleak. To be completely honest, like I wasn't convinced by any stretch of the imagination that it was about to go to $1,400. So I don't want to pretend that I was, because I wasn't back then. I had, not that it's necessarily any different today, right? But I had no idea what was going to happen. We didn't necessarily know that countries were going to start buying crypto, and that you're going to have institutions getting interested in crypto, and big companies like Tesla getting interested in crypto, and MicroStrategy. We didn't know that back then. And it's not like there was a lot of market cycle theory developed back then either. So you have to think about, like, I didn't know that what was going to happen back here. I suppose that it just as easily could have broken back down and come back down in a different parallel universe, but we didn't. We sort of held the line back here at the lower bound, and then we ultimately broke out, and then you can see what happened. Now, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying this has to happen, but it is just something we have talked about for the last year. And I would argue that it would be doing it somewhat of a disservice to just say, all right, we're going to abandon it now, when really it's actually just it's just repeating the same move that we did back then in terms of maybe just going back down to the bottom of the same range that we've been testing for the last year. And if that were to happen, then it would basically mean, going back down to the $2,000 level, and maybe even going below it down to $1,700, which is where we went earlier, and not really moving back up until the beginning of March. So that would be what that means. I would assume that if this happens for Ethereum, if Ethereum's coming back down to the bottom of this range over here, well, then obviously for Bitcoin, that I think you would argue that means Bitcoin's going back to 30K, maybe even slightly below 30K. I mean, it went below 30K before. It went to 28, 29K. So if Ethereum goes back to less than 2K, and if Ethereum goes back to less than $2,000, then the natural implication would be that Bitcoin's dragging it down in its own route to less than $30,000. So I think those would more or less go hand in hand. If you see Ethereum at 2K, I would say there's a good chance you're going to see Bitcoin at around $30,000. So look, we'll have to wait and see what happens. I know people are generally upset right now. There is a lot of volatility in crypto. That's not going to change. Okay, I mean, we actually saw a very similar correction back in the summer, and back then we went all the way down to $1,700, and it did not feel nearly as fearful in the market as it does right now. Like it seems like investor sentiment now is so much worse than it was back in the summer, despite the fact that we're currently sitting at higher prices. We might go back down to those levels, but we are currently sitting at higher prices. So then, to just briefly talk about, what will be a counterpoint to this if we're not going to hold these levels, and let's just give ourselves all the wiggle room and say, it goes from 1,700 all the way up to about 4,000 or so. If this doesn't hold, then, what is the natural implication of that? Well, I have to imagine that if Bitcoin is going to go back down to say $20,000 or something, if it goes back to 20K, I don't think Ethereum is going to hold at 2K. Okay, I mean, that would mean that the Ether Bitcoin ratio is 0.1, and I really just don't see Ethereum Bitcoin getting to 0.1 in the next couple of months. So if Bitcoin, if Bitcoin were to go back to $20,000, then I think it would be safe to assume that Ethereum is probably looking back at its own prior all-time high of approximately $1,400. So, look, this is how many weeks now in a row? 10 weeks, I believe, in a row where the market has just been trending down with basically no relief at all. Investors are certainly getting cranky, and every major support just seems to be falling out from beneath us. We're slicing through them like butter, like they weren't even there. We saw that with Bitcoin. It went to 53K. It didn't care about that. It then went to the 46K level. It then broke below 46K. It then went down to 42 to 43K level for a little bit, and then now broke below that. Now it's at 36K, and we're still sort of in the middle of a free fall even as I make this video. So there's certainly no guarantees on anything. And when you have a macroeconomics looking relatively bleak in the short term, and you're watching things like the NASDAQ pull back 2.75% today, and it's basically been pulling back like 2% every single day for the most part for quite some time. This was the worst week for the NASDAQ that we've had since March of 2020. Okay, and I mean, I understand that Ethereum and the NASDAQ are separate things, but if you just simply compare the two, you really can't argue that there isn't any correlation, right? So we'll pin this over here on the right scale to a new right scale. You can see how correlated Ethereum has been to the NASDAQ. Okay, so while we would all love it if Bitcoin and Ethereum did not care about what the NASDAQ was doing, we would love that, right? But unfortunately, that's not the way it is. And if the NASDAQ is rolling over like this, then we're more than likely going to see Ethereum roll over with it. Okay, so if the NASDAQ continues to pull back, then I would imagine we're going to see the same thing happen for Ethereum. And one thing that we can do to look at that is if I pull up another screen over here. So let me pull this up really quick. So if we look at, say, let's just pull up the NASDAQ. And I wanted to pull this up, not because necessarily a lot of you are interested in it, but we might be able to learn something from it, right? Like it is possible that we can, we can learn something from looking at this stuff. So if you go look at the NASDAQ, this is what it looks like, right? And right now, let's switch this back over to the normal candles, right? So right now, the NASDAQ is actually testing the September low, okay? Now remember, Bitcoin blew past its own September low, right? I mean, like it didn't even care about it. It just blew right past it. So did Ethereum, right? You can go back and look at Ethereum, and the September low was at like 2,600, and now we are. These are the Heikin candles. So if I actually go back over here, the September low for Ethereum was around 2644. You can see we're already $100 below that. So if we're watching the NASDAQ next week, so I mean it's currently trading's currently closed, but if next week we're watching the NASDAQ and it's bouncing off of this level, then perhaps we'll see Ethereum bounce off of where it currently is, okay? Perhaps. But if the NASDAQ continues to just nuke and go down and perhaps go back down to, say, where it was back in March of 2021 or something, like if it just bypasses this support area here and then just goes all the way down, does something like this, which, I mean, that would be a pretty big pullback. You can see that the NASDAQ has already pulled back 13 or about 14%. Once it pulls back 10%, it's considered a correction. If it's 20%, it's considered a bear market. So if the NASDAQ were to pull back, let's say 20%, that would be technically people what I think call out a bear market for the NASDAQ. And I think you have to imagine here that if the NASDAQ is pulling back down to these levels, then you're most likely going to see Ethereum also pull back down to these levels as well. And then part of the hard part about this is there's some things that are going on that are just simply it's outside of our control. It's outside of our control to predict what's going to happen in terms of macroeconomics, right? I mean, clearly the Fed's trying to fight inflation, but they can't. I mean, well, theoretically they could do anything, right? But you have to assume that they would not want to just see the market drop 20% in a few weeks. That's not good for morale or anything. I mean, it's going to affect the economy for sure. So then the question is will the Fed then not be so hawkish on what they are proposing, or will they just go ahead and go through with it, and then the easily spooked investors that we are will sort of get over it and then just sort of try to move on at that point and say, all right, well, maybe it wasn't so bad. Look, in the short term, I would say more or less everything is going to be dependent on what you're seeing stocks do, what you're seeing the NASDAQ do. If it continues to pull back, it's hard to make the case that crypto is going to be going up in the short term. But as we've seen before, crypto is resilient. It certainly can drop a lot, but we also know that it can turn around quite quickly as well. One of the things that I keep thinking about when I look at this market is how quickly so many people have just lost complete faith. I mean, and look, I mean, it is certainly possible that we could come down significantly from here. I'm not trying to say we can't, but when you look at this market and you see what it has accomplished since March of 2020, and to think about if we just sort of mentally go back to our former selves when Ethereum was trading for less than $100 just a couple years ago, and to think that a couple years later we'd all be freaking out over a $2,500 ETH or even a $1,700 ETH for that matter. It does show you just how quickly this market can change. And so look, I will say this right now. If you can't handle the volatility, then you can get out, right? I mean, that is an option. I'm not saying you should do that. I do think that the people that stick around crypto for the long haul will do quite well. But in the short term, no one knows what's going to happen, okay? Ethereum could go to 2K, could go to 1,700 and then go back up. Could also go to 1,400, right? It might hold the line at 2,500 and then go back up. No one knows what's going to happen in the short term. If you can't handle the volatility, then, I mean, this asset class certainly isn't for everyone. I'm not saying that is a bad thing. It's just that some people do not want to deal with volatility that can go up 2x in a few months, and then in a few months just wipe it all away again. Okay, for some people that's just simply too much to handle, and if that's too much to handle, then there are solutions to that, right? You could just get out of the market if it's not your thing. But we will still follow Ethereum and see if in fact we can continue on in this range that has mostly spanned from $2,000 to $4,000. We did deviate out of it slightly down to 1,700, and then we also briefly deviated out of it up to 4,800. And we'll see how well this idea of the market going sideways for a year to accommodate this rapid expansion that we saw. We'll see if that holds any water, or if it doesn't, and we go off on some completely different path. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. We also do the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. Thank you for tuning in, subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Bye.